Thank you for coming and welcoming you to the November 2011 edition of our monthly update. And I'm glad to see so many of you here. That's important for the Brecht Forum. It's important for what we're trying to do here. This one is going to be, as was announced in advance, a little different from what we usually do. That is, most of these, as some of you I know from coming all the time, you are required to endure me for most of the time. And you are not going to be required to do that this evening. We're going to change it a little bit, and I'm going to talk in the usual way, about a number of issues that have happened in the last month or so since we last had the October one, for about 40 minutes, I would guess. And then I'm going to introduce the gentleman on my left, only in terms of seating, of course. The gentleman on my left, who is a guest who comes to us from the University of Athens in Greece. And he's going to talk for, I don't know, 20, 25 minutes to give us the benefit of his insights as a person who lives in as well as works on the whole crisis of Greece and Europe as they struggle to cope with the global crisis of capitalism. We really couldn't have a person who is more steeped in what is going on, both as a person living in it and through it. And I also have asked our own resident expert on Greece, Costas Panayotakis, who teaches here in New York, to be the kind of initial respondent to what Professor Varoufakis is going to be saying to us, and then we'll open it up for your questions and comments. The timeliness of this, we couldn't know at the time we set this up, but it couldn't be better. In other words, the last few weeks, you've all seen the headlines, constant attention to crisis of Europe, crisis of the European Union, crisis of the Eurozone, crisis, crisis, crisis. It's even fairly obvious that for most newspapers here in the United States, there's an intense delight in imagining that the crisis in Europe is really much worse than what we have here, because it was so painful in the years earlier to have to draw the opposite conclusion. So this is really a delicious moment, and hopefully Professor Varoufakis will not take that away from us by his analysis of what is going on. There are more chairs back there, so please, those of you that are coming, there are also some chairs in the front here. And if you want to grab some chairs here, there are places. Yeah. Okay, while that's going on, let me talk to you a little bit about some things that have happened since we last met. As you know, we have said often that it is kind of remarkable in the crisis as it unfolds here that we've now had unemployment at 9% or higher for a very long time, that we are breaking records in the proportion of our unemployed that have been unemployed for more weeks than we have historically experienced. We've always been struck, and I've mentioned it to you, the kind of amnesia, historical amnesia that grips the United States, since we cannot seem to remember, and our political leaders have a complete amnesia here, that the last time we had unemployment bad like this, large like this, long-lasting like this, we as a people forced our leadership, Roosevelt in the 30s is what I'm talking about, to institute a federal program of employment. Let me just remind you of the statistic. Between 1934 and 1941, the federal government under Roosevelt created and filled 11 million federal jobs. To adjust that for the population today would be about 20 million federal jobs. It is astonishing not only that we have no federal employment program, it's astonishing that our leadership does not propose it. President Obama has never proposed any such program whatsoever. So it's not even necessary for the Republicans to oppose a federal employment program because the Democrats do not propose one. That is a kind of remarkable thing when you think about it, that the last time a Democratic president, same party as we have now, faced a situation like this, we can't even remember that that might be a policy option. President Bush, at the beginning of this crisis, said that the solution would be to provide incentives for the private sector to create more jobs. President Obama has repeated each and every year that that is his program as well. We have indeed provided incentives to private sector, and we have provided inducements. They have thanked the government for the incentives and inducements, taken them, and not hired anybody. And that continues to be the policy. The reason I mention this is I'm happy to tell you, or I'm not really happy, to tell you that last week, the senators of the United States, led by the Democrats, went through the following exercise. They supported a bill to spend $60 billion to hire people to rebuild crumbling U.S. roads, bridges, and mass transit systems. $60 billion. That isn't small, that's teeny, but it's something. And they forced a vote. And in order to win, you have to get 60 votes in the U.S. Senate because you have to defeat the ability of the other party to filibuster and so on. And unfortunately, last Thursday, when the vote was held, they only got 51 votes. So they couldn't break the GOP's opposition. And here was the issue. The Republicans said, with great intensity, that they wanted to know how the $60 billion would be raised to help hire unemployed people. And the Democratic bill had an answer. It was going to impose a 0.7% surtax. Now that's not zero, but it's getting there. A 0.7% surtax on incomes over $1 million per year. Okay, let's do that again. People earning over 1 million, I won't ask you to raise your hand, per year, are going to be required to pay an extra 0.7%. And on the basis of that outrage, which would have cost, I'm an economist, so I do numbers. I don't really, but to please my colleagues and to try to stay in the club, I do this. The jobs bill, this jobs bill, if it had passed, would have meant a new tax bill for the 350,000 taxpayers in America who average 2.9 million. That's all the people who get more than $1 million a year. Their average, the 350,000 who earn that much, is they get 2.9 million a year. So I did the math, and they would have had to pay $13,500 extra out of the 2.9 million they earned. On the basis of this outrage, the Republicans prevented that bill. I don't want you to applaud, but I want you to see that's called democracy in action. If you ever needed an example that the political structure responds in our country to a very small part of the population and serves its needs, we are not going to spend $60 billion on hiring thousands of unemployed, because it would have cost the people who earn an average of $2.9 million a year an extra $13,500. Think about it. While you're thinking about that, another small one, I'll get to bigger updates in a minute, but I wanted to regale you with a few smaller ones, just to, like an appetizer for the main meal tonight. I discovered a gentleman, with the help of some research, named David Zaslav, Z-A-S-L-A-V. He is the executive director of Discovery Communications, a very large communications corporation here in the United States. Discovery Communications runs 130 TV networks in the United States and in 200 countries. This is sort of impressive if you think about it. And they reach a combined audience of 1.5 billion people. And their headquarters are in Washington. And here's what I discovered for 2010. His compensation last year was $42.6 million. He would have been one of those people who'd have to pay an average, a huge extra for 60 billion. And then I discovered the following. His salary last year, his compensation, took home, let me read this to you because it's really, it kind of tells you something. Took home almost twice as much money as President Obama, Vice President Biden, the 9 justices of the Supreme Court, the majority and minority leaders of the House of Representatives, and every member of the US Senate combined. Let me do that again. The president of a major media company shaping what 1.5 billion people see on television made more money last year than all those leaders combined. Next item. In the time since our last update, 2 agencies of the government issued reports on changing income and wealth here in the United States. Typically in 1 month, we don't even have 1 report. We had 2. One of them was produced by the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, an interesting body that is quite well reputed in the United States. It's bipartisan. It includes both Republican and Democratic staffers. And the documents that they issue and the statistics they issue are usually credited by folks pretty much across the spectrum because of their long history of being pretty careful with their statistics, something which many other parts of the United States government are not. And they did a report issued a couple weeks ago called, and I have a copy here if any of you want to see it later, Trends in the Distribution of Household Income Between 1979 and 2007. So this is a really authoritative report on how income distribution in the United States has changed pretty much over the last 30 years, the last generation of the American history. And it is about as definitive a summary report on this as you're going to want to get. And if any of you are doing research or interested in that, this is a document to get. Just go to cbo.gov and you can find it on the internet. Here's what it shows. And before I say it, I don't mind editorializing. You probably have noticed I often don't mind editorializing. About this. They decided to organize their statistics in an interesting way, to juxtapose not just the usual breakdown, which economists do call quintiles. They divide the American income recipients into 4 groups, the poorest fifth, and the 3 middle fifths, and the richest fifth. They did that, but that really wasn't the main focus. For some reason that nobody could understand, they organized the statistic by looking at what happened to the top 1% and what happened to the 99 other percent. I have no idea why they did that. Certainly couldn't have anything to do with larger political movements in the United States, because a group of professional economists would not allow themselves to be swayed by grubby people in a neighborhood, you know, peeing in the street. They wouldn't do that. But for some reason, they decided to do it. And here's what they found. Between 1979 and 2007, the share of the total income received by the top 1% went up. And the share of income received by the 99 remaining went down, which, if you think about it, is a necessary implication. What's really interesting is that the top 1% doubled their share of income, roughly from 10% to 20% of the total income earned in the United States. That's impressive. And all the other people shared the reduction of the 10% that all the other people had to. And what was particularly interesting is that the people at the bottom, they didn't suffer much, they didn't lose much, because they don't get hardly anything anyway. So the people at the bottom didn't lose. And if you come and look at the bar graphs, the big reductions are in the middle. The middle 3 quintiles, the 60% of the people that are not the poorest 20% and not the richest 20%, that's where the drop in their share of income was the strongest. And when you think about American politics, that tells you something. It tells you where the bite came, from whom the people at the top took the extra, the doubling for themselves. The second thing in this report that's really interesting, if you have the time to look at it, is they did something that most reports don't do. After looking at the distribution of income and how much more unequal our distribution of income has come in the last 20 years, this is historically quite a move for that period of time. You don't normally see that in American history, that big a change in that short historical period. They did an interesting thing. They said, would it look differently if we added in not just the income people earned from their work and their money from stocks and bonds, but we added in government programs. How does the government affect it? Because the government taxes people differentially, and it makes what are called transfer payments. The government gives people income separately from what they earn. So it factored all of that in to see whether the claim that the government redistributes income and that it does so from rich to poor is the case. Their research discovered it is not the case. The inequality is actually slightly worse when you factor in taxes and transfer payments than if you don't. So it's an extraordinary document, not only about growing inequality, but in the fact, the inference you draw, that the rich not only got, the top 1%, double the amount of money into their hands that they used to, but they were smart enough to use it to make sure that the government did not redistribute it away from them as they were increasing their share. They neutralized any effect the government might have had on that inequality. Next. The second new report, as I told you, was produced by the Census Bureau. And this is even more remarkable. This is a special new report on poverty, which uses a whole, it's called the Supplemental Poverty Measure, SPM. So if you go to census.gov, that's what you look for, SPM's Supplemental Poverty Measure. And they did some new calculations, updated what are pretty out-of-date poverty measures in the United States. And so I thought I'd give you some of their results, the most dramatic, but it's worth taking a look if you have the time. First, according to the new measurement that they've done, the poverty line, everybody who earns income below that poverty line is officially considered to be living in poverty, is now 49 million Americans. So roughly 50 million Americans live below the poverty line. If you know what the poverty line is, it's about $22,000 for a family of 4. I'll do that again. $22,000 for 4 people. Works out to about $15 a day per person for everything. Your food, your clothing, your shelter, your education, your medical care, everything. And I would urge many of you to try to grasp this by trying to just keep a little notebook one day about how much you spend in an average day on everything. And if you can get it down to 15, you probably don't have too many days left to live. But in any case, everything, your medical care, what you spend to entertain yourself, think about it. Any case, 50 million Americans are poor by that standard. One of the most interesting things the new report discovered in this last month, when it was released, was that the earlier measures of poverty among young people, children, was too high, and they reduced it. But that the poverty among people aged 65 and over is much, much greater than had been understood. And that is an important reality. For example, young people in the United States don't vote. Old people do. Something that our president might want to think about. Apropos of that, last thing before I get to a slightly more substantive topic. From both men and women age 65 and older, the Social Security payments they get are the largest source of income, contributing more than all other sources, earnings, pensions, and assets combined. Why am I telling you this? And this is produced by the Institute for Women's Policy Research, which is actually a bit more interested in the greater dependence of women on the Social Security payments than of men. This, by the way, if you're interested, the Institute for Women's Policy Research is headed by Heidi Hartman. And Heidi Hartman was a graduate student with me when we both went through graduate student days together, and she and I were active in the same areas. I'm trying to give you a hint that the Institute for Policy Studies is an interesting source of data on these subjects because it is put together by somebody who has some social progressive commitments. Very interesting research. Why am I telling you this? Later this month, before we gather in December, the super committee, it's called, in Congress, will have had to make, by law, its decision. If you recall, they are now required to come up with, I remember what they were, $1.2 trillion worth of cuts, basically. Some things are on the table, some things are off the table, and if they can't come up with an agreement between the 6 Republicans and the 6 Democrats, then automatic cuts kick in that have been already specified, and these will be serious. And one of the areas where cuts are being contemplated are in Social Security. So I want you to understand that, once again, for both men and women age 65 and older, Social Security is the largest source of income, contributing more than all other sources combined. As these cuts are agreed to, and by the way, by cut I include moving the retirement age from 65 up to 67 or 68, which is one of the things they're likely to do. You are directly damaging the largest source of income for most people age 65 and older. Efforts will be made to suggest that these cuts are minor, or cosmetic, or trivial. They're not. They're very serious. And they're not only serious for the people who get it, but remember, we're at a time of high unemployment. People who would have retired at age 65 would thereby have opened the space for an unemployed or new entrance into the labor force to get that job. If you postpone the eligibility for Social Security, you are creating the need for people who might have left the job for another person to stay in that job. It directly worsens unemployment. And in view of the latest last month jobs report, where we increased the number of jobs in the United States by roughly 80,000, the private sector increased about 100,000, but the public sector laid off 20,000. The craziness of our society right now. It's roughly estimated in the United States that you need at least 100,000 new jobs per month just to keep up with the growth in the number of people. If you don't make more than 100,000 new jobs in a month, it means the unemployment rate is going up. You have to do over 100,000 in order to take care of the new job entrants as well as eat into the unemployed. So when you read the newspaper accounts, we added 80,000 jobs and you felt very good about it, since it is a number that's better than, say, no 1,000 jobs. It is better, but it is not enough even to reduce unemployment. It actually increases the proportion of our workforce that is unemployed, because it doesn't even match the number of people coming in. Okay, keeping to our schedule, let me turn then to a more general topic that came up in all the newspaper reports I saw before. I've talked about this before. This is a bit more abstract, but it is something for me just as important as the specific kinds of updates that I normally do. This has to do with, and it'll overlap what our guest is going to be talking about in a few minutes. This has to do with how we understand what is happening in Europe and Greece, but also in many other areas. And it struck me over the last month, as I kept notes preparing for tonight, that an awful lot of reports are written in the following way. Today, such and such a thing happened because the market dictates X. Or yesterday, the ministers in Europe gathered in order to try to calm the markets. In other words, the markets are a reality, a force, almost a person. The markets are dictating. The markets are unhappy. Oh, everything Mr. Papandreou does seems to make markets unhappy. And everything Mr. Sarkozy and Mrs. Merkel do seems to be designed to placate markets. It's as if markets is another name for some evil force. This sort of anthropomorphization of an institution is something that we all ought to be very critically oriented about. It's a bit of a hustle, it's a game. Instead of understanding what are the social arrangements, the social structures, the relationships among people that are imposing certain kinds of behavior on us, we abstract from the specific way society is organized and give the force not to an institution human beings created, but to something independent of us. The image Marx once used to capture this craziness is the image of Frankenstein. People create, human beings, scientists. Remember the story? Mary Bysshe Shelley putting it together. Human beings created something, they made it, but then it became a force dominating them. They kind of forgot, oh, no, wait a minute, it isn't something that dominates us, it's our creation. Markets are a creation of human beings. Through most of the history of the human race, goods and services were not distributed by markets. It's a relatively infrequent institution for distribution. Even today, all kinds of limits and institutions exist, arrangements exist, where goods and services are distributed from person A to person B, from the producer to the consumer, but not by means of a market. And by market, I mean a kind of quid pro quo. I'll give you 3 of these oranges, you give me 2 shirts. I'll give you 4 pieces of dollar, and you give me a hamburger. That's a market way of distributing. I'm not going to give you the hamburger. That is, I'm the hamburger maker. I'm not going to distribute it to you, the hamburger consumer, unless you give me something in return that satisfies me. That's a market arrangement. And you really kind of all know that we don't like markets in all kinds of situations. We don't create a market. We, in fact, block a market when we don't like it. There's nothing magical. Let me give you an examples. I can see from your faces. I need to. So the one I like most, I'll start with, is the example, because it's the month of November, it's the example of the Thanksgiving dinner. You gather with your grandma and your mother, and you sit around the table, and mother, because I'm talking about a traditional family, has been slaving over the stove all day making the turkey, stuffing it and glazing it and all the things you do with a turkey. And now, having made the turkey, she gathers the family, and an interesting act occurs. The turkey, made by the producer, Mama, is going to be distributed to all the members of the family. Here's something Mama is not going to do. Charge you for it. It's very important. You're not going to distribute the turkey by means of a market exchange. You're not. And similarly, at the end of the meal, when everyone has eaten too much, that's part of the tradition, of course, everyone's kind of ill, too much tryptophan, if you know the chemical that's actually in that bird. And then Mama, in a moment perhaps of weakness, reaches across the table and says to you, because you're a nice young person, would you please take out the trash that we've accumulated during the meal? But you, having just come back from college and your economics course, where you learned about the efficiency of a market, you're quick to answer, sure, Ma, $4. Because you're going to distribute to her the service of removing the garbage, and you want that this service be distributed to a person who has the money to make the quid pro quo market exchange. But surprised by this, your father, having witnessed this, reaches across the table and smacks you in the face. And then he gives you a very profound lesson in economics. And here's how it goes. Here's how it goes. That's disgusting, he says, looking at your eyes. What are you doing? Now watch the words. This is a family. We love each other. We do this. Mama made the turkey. She passed it to you. She asks you to help. We love each other. We want to help each other. Mama wanted to make the turkey. You should want to help out with the garbage. If we actually related to one another by paying each other quid pro quo for the job, that wouldn't be a loving relationship. That would be disgusting. Imagine if that philosophy operated outside the house too. Think a minute. If there's a contradiction between love and markets, what an idea. Whoa. Just imagine where that could go. And you know all the other exceptions too, right? There's nothing absolute about a market. We declare markets in certain things utterly illegal. If I walk up to one of you and suggest certain intimate acts together and you say to me, fine, $12, we got a problem. That's illegal. That's a market exchange. No, mustn't do. And the argument is the same. The argument in our culture is sex between us should be a matter of love, desire, affection, but it should not be a financial transaction, a market. That is, you go to jail for that. Not everywhere. And those people who insist on engaging in that have to hide it, have to keep it away because they can get into a lot. We forbid market transactions in sex, in drugs, in a whole lot of transactions. Wow. Here's another one to think about. A corporation needs a law. It goes to the people who make laws, our congressmen and women. And it says, how much? How much? I need a law. How much? If the congressman and woman says $15,000, they go to jail if they're caught. That's an illegal market transaction. We require them to go into enormous contortions to get this transaction done in such a way that there's no record of there having been the transaction that there was. What a strange arrangement. What a strange arrangement. So we don't allow we don't believe markets are some magical institution. But here's the best part. Even where we let markets go, let's remember what a market is. A market is not what is taught in the university. It's not about supply and demand. Markets do not supply what people demand. They supply what people can afford. That's a very different thing. We can easily here come up with the demands we think a society like ours has for goods and services to be produced. That's not what is in being produced, and it's not what's going to be produced. What's produced is where the money is. So now let's go back to what the CBO told us. Over the last 30 years, the 1% at the top are getting twice as much of the income. That means that goods and services, twice as many of them as before, are going to be used to supply the demand of that 1%. And the other 99% with 10% less of the income are going to get less of what they need and want. That's what the market does. It validates and reinforces the distribution of income. Last point. In honor of our Greek guests, I thought I would take a moment and go back to what some very important ancient Greeks had to say about markets, Plato and Aristotle. Both of them were very critical of markets. This will come as a blow to some of you who think markets were actually first discovered and put forward in the Bible. That wasn't the case. Jesus seemed relatively uninterested in Bibles. In markets. What a slip. But we go back to Plato and Aristotle, and they were both very critical. Both of them saw markets as dangerous for what they called social cohesion. Markets make people, as we can see, upset by the fact that goods and services are being produced for the rich, for those who have the money, and not for the people who don't. Supply doesn't meet demand. Supply meets who can afford it. And if you have unequal distribution, the afforders are a small number, disproportionate to the rest, and the markets serve them. That's what markets do. And that produces, Plato and Aristotle, envy, resentment, hostility, and it destroys the community. The only disagreement really between Plato and Aristotle was what to do about it. Plato said, get rid of it. Aristotle said, no, it'll be so socially disruptive to get rid of it. What we ought to do is regulate it. Make sure we get from it what it can do for a society, and we prevent it from all the terrible things it can do to a society. With that mentality, the notion that we should have free markets is anathema. Another Greek word. Anathema. Not good. Bad thing. Don't do it. Don't do it. Final point. During World War II, we had a problem in the United States. We needed to fight and win a war. And a war that was going to be tough. And there was a problem because the government realized it needed to have all the resources necessary to produce guns and planes and tanks and bullets and uniforms for the troops to fight and to win. Not, of course, here. That would be messy, but over there. And to get them over there in planes and ships. But there was a problem because if the goods and services of our country were really going to respond to the market, then lots of rich people who had the money would want to have a nice country home built with steel that could otherwise go into a tank. And they might want to have expensive toys and beautiful cars that would require all kinds of resources that wouldn't be available for bullets. We couldn't have a market. We had an important social task with a war. So we said to people, Roosevelt went on the air, and contrary to his ethnic background, he said, market, schmarket. That's an attempt at humor, folks, humor. Market, schmarket. We're not going to have a market. We're not going to let people buy things simply because they have the money. So what the United States did, I'm not describing another country, the United States, we issued ration cards. We had a rationing system in World War II. The government handed out little tickets. And you got as many tickets as the government thought you ought to have, given the size of your family, the age of your family, the medical condition of your family. It said, if you want to buy something, money is no longer enough. You can have all the money in the world. If you don't have one of these ration tickets, you're not going to get a quart of milk. You're not going to get a pound of sugar. You're not going to get a tank full of gas. Whoa. Let's do that again. The government distributed tickets, which you had to give to the storekeeper, the money for the quart of milk and the ticket. Money, no ticket, no milk. Okay? Here's the idea behind the government. They didn't use these language, but I'm gonna. We're gonna get the distribution of milk and sugar and gas. We're gonna distribute to each according to their needs. Because the government fails to do, another slip. Markets fail to do that. The government interfered to make the distribution of resources and products not conform to market laws, but instead to make sure with ration cards that we